Okay, I keep talking about these representatives who are chosen to speak for the people in their region. So, how exactly are these people chosen? Today we're going to talk about voting and the various ways we can elect a representative. Suffrage is an important aspect of democracy. It doesn't mean to suffer. See how it's spelled suffra, not er? Suffrage means to support, to share an opinion, and more importantly, it's used to define who has the right to vote. When Canada was first created, only men over the age of 21 who had property were allowed to vote. In 1970, the voting age was dropped to 18. It wasn't until 1917 that some women were given the vote, and by 1918 the government realized all women should have this right and passed the Act to confer the electoral franchise upon women. Franchise is another term similar to suffrage. The provinces varied in their granting of suffrage to women. Alberta in 1916, Quebec not until 1940. Another group who didn't initially have the right to vote were Aboriginal peoples in Canada. It wasn't until 1920 that all Native people in Canada had the right to vote, but a status Indian was required to give up their status and their treaty rights if they wanted to vote. It wasn't until 1960 that the government allowed First Nations people to vote without having to give up their status. One major issue relating to elections in Canada is our voter turnout. Since the 1960s, we've seen the overall voter turnout is declining. One way to tackle this is to change the way we hold elections, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. But another suggestion has been to make voting mandatory. We say that voting is both a right and a responsibility, but should we have punishments if you don't live up to that responsibility? There are many countries like Australia that do have mandatory voting. They have a higher voter turnout, which is good because you'll have a better understanding of what the people want. But it could also mean that they're not really thinking about who they're voting for because they're being forced to do it. Besides, isn't forcing someone to vote violating their freedoms to choose? So I mentioned that another way to tackle our low voter turnout is to change the way we hold elections. To start off with, let's get you familiar with some of those important key terms relating to elections. The electorate are the people who have the right to vote. The electorate live in a specific constituency, also known as a riding. This is the geographical area that the representative is responsible for. All the people who live in that constituency are the constituents of that representative. Airdrie is in the federal riding or electoral district known as Wild Rose, and in the next election will become a new riding called the Banff-Airdrie riding. Why is it changing? Remember those key aspects of representative democracy we talked about way back in video 2? One of those techniques is representation by population. That means each riding must be of the same approximate population. If there's 2 people who have a representative and 8 people who have a representative, which group has more power? While it may seem that the big group of 8 is more powerful, remember they only have one voice, so it's actually the group of 2 that has more power. That's why we sometimes change our constituencies, to balance the population. Another technique we mentioned way back in video 2 was secret ballot. This is very important because it makes sure that people can really voice their opinion. Often when somebody has a minority opinion, they're afraid to share it. Have you ever wanted to say something in class but were too afraid to because you were worried nobody else would agree with you? Because no one knows who I'm voting for, they can't bully me into voting for someone else or bribe me. A third technique to protect democracy that was mentioned in the second video is periodic elections. That's elections that are held within a certain amount of time. This lets the government know that they actually have the legitimate right to rule because they asked us who we wanted. Until recently, Canada had elections that were held within every 5 years. But the problem was the Prime Minister could choose when to call an election. That caused a problem because the Prime Minister would call an election when he knew his party could win. So to solve this problem, recently governments in Alberta and at the federal level have chosen to have fixed date elections. This means that the Prime Minister can't just call an election whenever he wants to. But there is a downside. Periodic election campaigns are short, usually just about a month. But because with fixed date elections, everybody knows when the election is coming, the election campaigns can go on and on. Okay, so let's talk about how elections are held, known as electoral systems. We're going to look at 2 different systems today. But first off, I need to explain the difference between votes and seats. Votes are the number of people who want you to be their representative and voted for you. Seats are what you get if you win the most votes, and it literally is a seat in the House of Commons. And seat equals power because the party with the most seats gets to become the governing party, the party that gets to create the laws. So when we look at the popular vote, we're looking at the total votes cast in an election for a particular candidate or party. But we also look at the number of seats won by a particular party across the country to figure out who's going to be the government. Problem. Here in Canada, the popular vote and the number of seats often don't match. This is because of the electoral system we use. It's called first past the post. To get the seat for your riding, you must win a plurality, which means more than anyone else, but it's not necessarily a majority. Why not? Well, remember, Canada is a multi-party system. If you have 5 parties all trying to get the most votes, someone can get 40%, and that's going to be more than any other party, so that candidate gets the seat for the riding, even though 60% of the electorate voted against her. But just like in a race, whomever gets past the post or the finish line first wins. Let's look at the chart here. It's a fake election. Who won the first riding? It's the Liberal Party with 45%. What about the second riding? It's the Alliance Party. That was a party that was created in Alberta to represent the more conservative ideologies that existed in Western Canada. Look at the percentage of vote they got, 75%. That would tell you that this riding is most likely in Alberta. Now look at the third riding. Hopefully you'd be able to figure out that this riding would be in Quebec because the Bloc Québécois does not have candidates running in Alberta. Okay, look at the rest of the chart. Who won the remaining ridings? It was the Liberals each time. But only once did the Liberal Party win a majority, more than 50% of the vote. Yet they got 5 seats, which means if these were the only ridings in Canada, the Liberal Party would have over 70% of the power, or seats, with the actual support from less than 40% of the population, or 40% of the vote. That's what we call an artificial majority. The Liberals have been given more power than what Canadians want them to have because they won ridings with less than 50% of the vote. And the problem with majority governments in Canada is that because of party solidarity, a majority of government gets to pass any law they want. If the party leaders want a law passed, all of the party members must vote for it or they'll be kicked out of the governing party, and they don't want to do that. So an artificial majority is giving a political party a lot of power that Canadians really don't want them to have. Confused? That's okay. A lot of Canadians are. Here's some real election results that show what happens. Look at the difference in the bars for the minority party's actual vote compared to the number of seats they got. The Green Party got 6.8% of the popular vote, but because of first past the post, they didn't even get 1 seat. Because first past the post can create artificial majorities, this can contribute to voter apathy. People don't want to bother to go out to vote. Remember, we talked about the issue of low voter turnout in Canada. Airdrie is traditionally a very conservative town that votes for right-wing parties. So if I vote for a left-wing party, I know my vote won't really matter because my candidate's not going to win. So Sweden takes a totally different approach. Instead of using first past the post, they use something called proportional representation. The ballots are tallied up for the entire country, and each party gets seats based on the percentage of the vote they got from everyone. So if they got 37% of the popular vote, they get 37% of the seats in their legislature, known as the Reichstag. So each party gets a proportion of power based on the proportion of the vote. That's why it's called proportional representation. Many people argue this is more democratic because it actually represents what the people want. It's also better for minority groups because they're more likely to have their voice heard in government. Look at how our House of Commons would change if we used proportional representation. See how the smaller parties would have more representation if we counted all of the ballots instead of just focusing on who won each of the individual ridings? Of course, there's issues with this system as well. Because there's usually a minority government, which is a government that has less than 50% of the power, the ruling party will have to work with other parties in order to get support for their leader. This means they may have to compromise some of their political promises to get the support of the other parties to create a coalition. Also, ridings with proportional representation don't get to choose their representatives. In Canada, we vote for a party, but we also look at who the candidate is. With a system based purely on proportional representation, the party gets to choose who will represent the region in Parliament. And minority governments are often unstable, which can lead to elections being called early because the ruling party can't get enough support to pass legislation. And elections are very expensive. Finally, while Canada may have artificial majorities that may not listen to minority groups enough, with proportional representation, it's much more likely you're going to get fringe parties elected. In Europe, after the 2008 economic crisis, some parliaments saw both fascists, think Nazis, and communists to their legislature. So to sum it all up, there's many issues relating to elections. In the past, there were many groups that didn't have suffrage. Today in Canada, we want a higher voter turnout because we need to know who the people really want to represent them in government. But because of first past the post, many people feel that the artificial majorities are preventing people from really being represented. However, when anybody brings up the idea of using proportional representation, many Canadians like that idea even less because of the problems that come with that system. So figuring out the best way to choose your representative can be very difficult.